In at number 10 is the Deon, and there is no doubt that this is one of the most useful creatures on the island, namely for its bossing abilities. Obviously this isn't going to be the creature which is going to defeat any kind of boss. It does not have the melee damage to do that, but if you level up this thing's food stat like absolute crazy, and then you can use this thing to heal up your dinosaurs in the boss fight, which is a very useful thing, and especially because there's no things like snarls on the island. Yes, you can transfer, but all the creatures on this list do natively spawn on the island, so don't expect any others. The Deon is pretty much your only option out there, and its ability is just so good and it is so easy to use. The only real downside being the amount of meat it consumes, and you're going to need to really pump that hunger, but it actually isn't too bad and it is definitely worth it. In at number 9 is the Basilosaurus, and this creature is pretty much your best bet for doing any kind of cave runs which you'll find out there. Obviously underwater ones, this thing is not a land creature, and I think there are 2 underwater caves on the island, one of the artifacts being used for the Megapithecus and one of them being used for the dragon. I'm pretty sure there's only 2, yeah, there is only 2 underwater caves, and the Basilosaurus is going to be extremely useful in all of those cases. It has the damage to deal some of a fight. Yes, it isn't going to stack up to the Mosasaur, but the fact that this thing is immune to electric eels and jellyfish and all those things makes this one of the most safe creatures to take into the ocean, as most of the threats are now just not even able to do their main abilities. The only thing you really have to take into mind is the fact that they have a depth limit, but as a nice little bonus, these things will also passively make oil. Next up, we have the Yutyrannus, and again, compared to the Deon, the story is very similar. This is a great boss creature, which I think is highly essential for the island, and it is useful on all 3 of those boss fights, and it definitely is one which you'll want to use at some point 100%, as obviously this isn't going to deal the damage in the boss fight, although you could use Yuties for that. That's not really their use case, and they're not going to heal up the creatures because that's the Deon's job. This thing will buff up all of those creatures with its all famous Courage Roar, and courageous you can also be if you drop a quick sub on the channel. It is always greatly appreciated. But it also does have the Fear Roar as well, which isn't particularly useful for bosses due to the size limit on the Fear Roar, but if someone's trying to raid your base in PvP on a Pteranodon, then you can use the Fear Roar if you have a Yutyrannus on you, and they will have no chance in raiding you or scouting your base out whatsoever. Good PvP tip if you didn't know that already. In at number 7 is the Allo, and this creature is a really great entry level carnivore on the island, and you may get somewhat angry with what I've put in the number 2 spot. If you know me already, you'll know what's in that spot, and you might want to put the Allo in the number 2 spot, and the creature which is in number 2 in this spot, and that is totally fine. You can form your own opinions on these dinosaurs. This is just my take, as albeit the Allo is an amazing creature, inflicting a great amount of bleed damage and having a very useful pack buff, it just isn't my go-to carnivore of choice, as it is a little bit too out of reach in terms of the level in some ways of when it is unlocked, as it is a much harder tame than the other one that is on this list, obviously. And also, I kind of don't like the size as much. I prefer those smaller carnivores. I just feel like I have a little bit more protection, and albeit the Allo is much more powerful than the creature which shall not be named, which is obviously in the number 2 spot, the Allo is just, I don't know, it's just not as appealing to me in a lot of ways. But I will definitely say that it is a truly amazing creature, which if you get the chance to on the island, which everyone realistically should, and especially on ASA, as they are so easy to tame with the new baby dino mechanic, you really can't miss out on taming a pack of Allos. Remember, pack size is always 3, so if your pack aren't working, if you only have 2 Allos, get a third one, and that pack buff will appear. Next up on the list we have the Rex, and this is pretty much your go-to boss creature which you can use on the island. Although in the honourable mention section of this video there are a couple of other creatures which are great boss creatures, but which sadly didn't make it on my top 10, but they may have made it on yours. Either way, back to talking about the Rex, you can kind of tell why this is such a great boss creature. It is a big hunking carnivore with great big teeth and a lot of power. And compared to a lot of other carnivores, I feel like I'm saying a lot, just did say it twice in a sentence there, but either way, compared to other carnivores, this thing's health is actually way higher than loads of the other options, making it the ideal boss creature for you to go with, as it is just such a balanced creature. While yes, it isn't the carnivore which deals the most amount of damage on the island, which is still allowed into bosses. The Giga I'm not counting here, as the Giga is sort of in a different league as a carnivore, but in terms of things like the Spino, yes, it will deal more damage, but its health is a lot lower, so the Rex is usually the go-to, and the Rex is significantly easier to tame, and its saddle also doesn't require silica pulse to craft, which can be a very big annoyance. Although at that stage of the game it isn't too much of a hindrance, it still can be a bit of one. In at number 5 is the Thyla, and there is a lot to say about the Thyla, and this creature is just so good at so many things, and it is actually one of the most versatile art creatures in my opinion. I've just done a top 10 on that recently, so if you go look on the channel you can see that top 10 if you're keen on it. And also in terms of the Thyla's abilities, and obviously apart from it just being versatile, this thing is a really great climber of all things. You saw it climb redwood trees there, but it can climb any kind of wall or vertical surface. Although meshing and meshes is a big glitch on ASA at the moment, so you can get yourself into some pretty sticky situations with terrain, and even fall through the terrain if you know that's your thing. But you know, ASA is still an early access game. They could have definitely worked on it a lot more though. But in terms of its other abilities as well, it isn't just a really great travel mount. Although it is a great use for it, it is also a really great carnivore, sadly not being allowed into boss fights. But I guess we have the Deinonychus on Valguero if you want a boss creature with kind of similar abilities to this, as that creature can also climb, but it is allowed into bosses, and in my opinion it is better than the Thyla, but that doesn't spawn on the island, so therefore it does not qualify for this list. But the main reason for its great attack is obviously that bleed ability which it has. Barely any other carnivores have this, which kind of doesn't make sense considering what they're doing and they're literally ripping right into a creature. You'd expect bleed damage to occur, but most carnivores don't even use that ability, and the fact that this has it is a huge bonus. Next up we have the Theri, and would it really be a list without the Theri here? This creature is just so useful for so many things, it had to be put on this list. The Freddy Krueger of Ark, with its saddle and locked at level 69.
Nice.
This thing really does pack a punch in all of its abilities. Namely, its fiber gathering, which barely any creatures can stack up to, although the Moss Chops is a great shout in the early game. Sadly, it isn't on the list or in the honourable mentions, but you know, I guess it got a little mention here with the Theri. But also the Theri is great at gathering berries as well, and so with wood and thatch too. And it is a pretty good meat gatherer as well, as this thing really does pack a punch in terms of damage. And it is the go-to creature for doing the dragon boss fight, as that boss is very unfair to all kinds of carnivores, and it is really nice to have this creature as a backup. Although the only real downside is sweet vegetable cake is the only way that you can really heal these things up in a quick manner. But if you have a Deon with you, that really shouldn't be too much of an issue. In at number 3 we have the Baryonyx. And would it really be a top 10 the island creatures list without this thing appearing at some point. This is by far the best caving creature on the island, and there is no competition at all. No creature can stack up to this thing in all of its abilities. It is just so good at caving. It has to be put on this list for all of its greatness in every aspect of caving. It's the right size and it deals a heavy amount of damage with a reasonable health stat, great stamina and great weight to go with it too. There is nothing which could really be improved about with this creature. Maybe apart from it not eating normal meat instead of fish meat, and the fact that it spawns in the swamp isn't great. But I'm happy to take those as some side effects for a creature which is just this good. It is almost too good to be true. And it also does have a right click attack in the water which can stun creatures up to the size of a Megalodon. And it is a very viable solution if you don't have a Basilosaurus for the underwater caves on the island. And this is the creature which I said when I was talking about the Allo. You may be a little bit upset at this being in the number 2 spot, but I absolutely adore the Carno in so many ways. It has to be put on the number 2 slot for me. The also amount of nostalgia I get from this creature is insane, and it has the bleed ability too, and although it doesn't have the pack buff, it is a much more manageable size, and also it is a very nice carnivore to control as well. Albeit the Allo has a nice turning circle and all of that, but the Carno really just feels much nicer to control, and in my opinion it is just a better designed creature. And also with its comedically small arms, you have something to laugh about with this thing too, and it just has so much character around it. And again, its saddle level being in the 40s or 50s, I can't remember. You see, it's one of those. It's very achievable for any Ark player really, if you just put a little bit of effort into the game. It is a really great carnivore in the early stages, of obviously mid stages as well. And you don't even need the saddle to fully utilize this creature. You can just have it following you around on adventures until you get that saddle, and you could be leveling up along the way to get it ready for when you first ride it. A very good strategy actually, considering that trank arrows unlock at level 21, and from there it is really easy to make a basic wooden trap and just trank this thing out. You really cannot go wrong with the Carno. But before we get into number 1, I have a few quick honourable mentions. And finally, in at number 1, we have the RG. And really, what did you expect? This thing is an absolute beast of a creature which really does deserve to be respected. And it is a go-to on all maps except Operation and Gen 1, as obviously flyers aren't allowed on those maps. But on all other maps, you need an RG really. These creatures are just that useful. They are the pinnacle of metal resource gathering, and when paired with something like an Anki or a Dodic, which I'm kind of going to tie into the number 1 spots here, as they really work well together as creatures, you have yourself pretty much the best harvesting creature combination which you could possibly have. The RG has weight reduction on things like metal, crystal, obsidian, and much more, and paired with something like the Anki, which can gather insane amounts of metal, it really is set up for success. And the RG deals a reasonable amount of damage as well, has a great weight stat and a great stamina stat, which is actually why the stamina didn't even make the top 10 list, as usually I'll just go straight to the RG, and albeit the Pteranodon is a good tame which is great for beginners and very beginner friendly, I always just go straight for the RG and don't even bother with the Pteranodon. And on top of that as well, its saddle acts as a portable smithy, which is a nice thing if one of your metal weapons breaks out on your travels, or your flak armor in cave runs, and also it has a nice little neat regen buff if you eat a dead corpse. This creature is amazing. In at number 10, we have the Castoroides. And the reason why I put this thing in this spot on the list, and actually the reason why it's just on the list, is it is one of the most insane wood gatherers out there. And before you get something like the chainsaw, this is pretty much your best option for wood gathering. And obviously you can go into beaver dams as well and raid wood out of them. But if you want consistent, reliable wood gathering, there really isn't a better creature than the Castoroides. And although you might say its saddle is a kind of non-beginner level one, but still arc beginners can make their ways into level 50s and 60s and up to the 70s. I'm not going to go up to there. I'm going to put 59 as a max level, but this is mainly just targeted for new arc players, other than just if you're just starting out on a map and you've played loads of arc anyway, then you should know what to tame and be fine. But if you've never played the island before and you're just coming new on ASA, or you just like starting arc, the Castoroides is a great creature to look up to and eventually tame, and it is a pretty good underwater creature too, although there are some better ones out there for some lower level saddles. Next up we have got the Megalodon, and in my opinion this is the best creature for early game ocean travel, as it isn't a particularly difficult one to tame, and quite a lot of the time you can find one glitched on the shore. I've done that actually quite recently. I tamed a Megalodon. It was like a level 150 something. I've got like really stupidly high levels, but that wasn't on my single player world. It was on a server. It was 156, so I'm pretty sure 180 was the max level on that server. And it was just stuck on the beach, and I just shot some tranks into it, and obviously then it knocks out. And they don't even need fish meat to be tamed. I'm not even sure if they can be tamed with fish meat. They must be able to be, but you can just tame them with normal meat and use prime meat as well. And I think you can use mutton too to tame these things really quickly, although I've never actually used mutton when taming one. I've used prime and normal. I never use fish meat when taming these things. They must eat it, but normal meat's easier to get your hands on, and they also deal the bleed ability and quite a significant amount of damage, and they're pretty fast as well. The only thing you have to watch out for is potentially a low stamina stat if you're going for a lower level, so make sure you don't drown. But overall, pretty easy, very effective ocean tame. Next up, we got the Beels, and this has to be on the list, as if you didn't know already, cementing paste is an extremely useful resource in the Ark game. And this is one of those creatures which can gather loads of cementing paste by killing insects. And if you ever go to the insect cave in the redwoods, bring one of these things. Obviously, you might not be able to get the artifact, as there are just so many insects in there, but if you've got a high level Beels, you'll be able to get the artifact and loads of cementing paste on your way. And if you have a Megatherium, you can get loads of chitin too, and that is again another extremely useful resource. And you can even make cementing paste with chitin and stone in a mortar and pestle, but it is much easier to do it with the Beels here. And if you're looking for an underwater tame of sorts, this will be a great option and a better one than the Castoroides in my opinion, because it's faster. It can stick up some kind of fight, although maybe not the best kind of fight, but you know, it swims at a decent speed. You can get around to places quite easily. So for some maybe silica pearl gathering and some of the underwater caves you'll find in the island, non-artifact ones of course, it can be a pretty useful creature. Next up, we got the Stegosaurus, and for a beginner, this is pretty much the best berry gatherer which you can physically get your hands on in the island. It is a pretty slow tame, so it's not too hard to knock out, and although on official it does take quite a significant amount of time to actually be tamed, you're probably going to be playing single player if you're just starting out, or maybe just choose a server with some higher rates, because it can take like a couple of hours to tame even a really low level one. But no one really goes with that anymore. It's a bit of an unnecessary point I made there, but still a very easy tame. They're pretty slow. Just feed them meadows. You don't need to feed them crops or kibble or anything. You're probably not at the stage of the game yet where you will do that, or even at this point know how to effectively do it. Even me right now, I've like basically never used kibble. I don't get into all of it. I'm a mutton kind of person, and I don't really grow vegetables either. Meadow berries is usually as far as I go. I've made sweet vegetable cake, obviously, for some tames, but you know, this doesn't need any of it. Just give it some meadows and you've got yourself an insane berry gatherer. If you're on a PvP server and you think you're raiding some bases too, it can be a useful creature to aid in that department, as well as they have a lot of damage reduction, again with their 3 plate modes. The sharpened plate is going to gather all your berries. The hardened plate, I think, is that the turret? It's either a turret soaking one, or it will, no, the hardened plate is the turret soaking one, and then the heavy plate will be used to gather things like wood and all of that. So yeah, very useful creature for multiple playing styles. Next up, we've got the Raptor, but also in this spot, I'm going to check the Sarco as well. I don't have any B-roll for the Sarco, but you find that creature in the swamp. Their saddle's unlocked at, I think, level 38, and they're a really good tame for underwater travel, and they deal quite a lot of damage. Definitely one that you should check out if you haven't already, because I know loads of you have been talking about the Sarco. So I wanted to give it a quick mention here to just say, I've heard you and I've not forgotten about it, and I do think it is a great beginner tame on the island. Just be careful, as they are quite quick, and you'll probably want to trap it in a 2x4, no, 2x2 kind of stone trap. I'm not sure if they can break wood. No, I'm pretty sure they can break wood, but slowly you can probably get away with wood. Maybe go for stone if you've never done it before. Make a basic trap, lure it into it. Maybe try and find one that isn't in the swamp biome. If you go to the, I'm not really sure what it's called, but is it called like the Hidden Lake or something? Either way, in the north, you'll kind of see a lake, which is actually pretty near where I recorded this B-roll for the Raptor, and you can sometimes find Sarkos in there. Going to the swamp biome as a beginner may not be your best bet. But either way, talking about the Raptor, this thing's saddle was unlocked at level 19, so you can get it really early on. It can be bowlered and tranked really easily, or even clubbed, or you can use a slingshot if you feel like that as well. So it's a much lower level tame in terms of resource compared to the Sarco, and they're pretty quick, although their weight isn't that great. You can obviously level it up, and you're probably not going to be doing metal runs or anything like that with these things. Wouldn't advise it, but just they are a really great carnivore for just getting you started in Ark, so I do think they have to be put on this list for that matter. In at number 5, we've got the Megatherium, and this creature is one which I talked about earlier, being an insane chitin gatherer, and that is partly why I put it here, but it is also an insanely great boss creature. And I was going to put the Theri on this list, although I thought that wasn't really a beginner tame, as its saddle level is just so high up, but I guess I'll mention it briefly. The Theri is just a great gatherer of all basic beginner resources, and it's great for the dragon boss fight, although you may not be thinking about that quite yet on the island at the stage that you are. But the Megatherium is one for the Broodmother, and the Broodmother is probably the first boss which you're going to do, or if you want the easiest one, go for the Megapithecus, although a Gamma Broodmother really isn't that bad. And Megatherium spawn everywhere, and they're not actually too bad to tame, and they're not just useful for boss fights. Again, they can gather insane amounts of chitin. That's also to see why they're so great at the Broodmother, not because they gather loads of chitin, but you will get loads of chitin from the Broodmother boss fight. It just has a very extreme buff when it kills an insect, and the Broodmother spawns as spider-like minions, and from that you can get the buff and then deal loads of damage to the Broodmother, which is why it's so useful. But it also acts as a pretty nice berry gatherer at this stage of the game. Again, very easy tame. Its saddle isn't too expensive, I'm pretty sure, and it's not unlocked at too late of a level, and it's so useful for a variety of things, mainly chitin gathering, but also bosses if you want to get into bosses and those gamma bosses in the early stages. Next up, we got the Pteranodon, and I had to put this down on the list, and I guess I'll mention the RG as well. Go for the RG if you can. You can make a very basic trap for it. Just you can use wood, 2 foundations, and then chuck in 8 door frames around it and chuck 2 ceilings on. You'll need to place those 2 extra door frames on once the RG's in the trap, and boom, knock it out. Easy RG tame like that. But the Pteranodon is probably the first flyer that you'll ever get on Ark, especially on the island. If it was Crystal Isles, then I'd probably say do some explorer runs and get a Crystal Wyvern. But the Pteranodon on most maps, obviously that support flyers, so not Operation and Gen 1, or Crystal Isles in my opinion, then you'll be getting this creature, and it is actually a pretty decent option for raids as well with that C spin attack. C is just the keybind for that attack. If you're a console player, that might not mean anything to you, but I just call it a C attack because that's the button. Either way, that's quite useful for PvP raiding, so if you're a PvP beginner, this could be a nice creature to window into that. Their saddle is relatively inexpensive, although the 25 chitin or keratin, you can get either. I would say chitin is easier, just kill some ants or a trilobite or something like that, and you'll get that. It's much easier than just farming loads of carb enemies and then getting all of the keratin that way. But, you know, it also just depends on what biome you are, what map you are, and where you've spawned, and actually what resource you have available to you. But they're a pretty fast flyer in the early game. They'll get you up in the air, which will severely speed up your progress. Although their weight and stamina aren't great, they can obviously be leveled, and if you tame a higher level one, which, you know, you'll probably do at some point, then that will obviously improve. And again, they can be bouldered really easily. If I haven't said that already, I don't know why I said again. They can be bouldered, they don't need to be trapped, and they can be very simply tranked, or you can use clubs, although a couple of trank arrows will do the job. In at number 3, we have the Thyla, and I have to put this thing here as it's one of the most mobile creatures on the island. And if you have access to the net projectile, you may not, doesn't matter, you can obviously tame this thing. It's basically the RG trap, which I mentioned, so 2 foundations of wooden foundations, of course. Then there's 8 door frames. You can place all of them down, you don't need to wait till it's logged in, and then just put 2 ramps on the outside and it'll do it. The only reason you need the ceilings there for the RG trap is because it flies. This thing doesn't fly, and as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really jump that high in the wild. Pretty sure. I don't really see it do that in the wild. A tamed one could get out of the trap, but a wild one can't, and that kind of plays you a benefit, because once you tamed it, you can get out of the trap. Obviously, you can just destroy the trap as well. Either way, very, very simple tame, not too difficult to trap. Just be careful that it doesn't bite you. A Pteranodon can be great assistance into luring this thing into the trap as well, to stop that happening, as it has the bleed ability. If you're not well armored or well protected, then, you know, it may not offer the best kind of security for you, and you could end up dying. And considering that you'll be in the red ones on taming one of these things, you don't want to. Always, as a precaution, place some sleeping bags around the area that you'll be taming, so if all does go wrong, you can actually spawn back in. I know it may seem a bit overkill, but you can always just demolish them afterwards to get half of the resources back, or if your server or world allows, just pick them back up again. You really don't want to risk it too much. And once tamed, you got yourself an absolute beast of a creature, and they have to be mentioned on this list, as they really are some of the most insane small carnivores out there which you can find. In at number 2, we have the Baryonyx, and this is pretty much the best cave creature on the island. And considering caves is probably something which you may want to be doing at this stage, if you've obviously got to the stage of taming a Baryonyx, then this is going to be your best bet out there. They deal a very decent amount of damage, have a very decent amount of health, and their size is perfect enough that you can get into a cave and get out. And these things will help you so much for getting through the masses of Onyx, Pulmonoscorpius, and Araneos, and also Arthropleuras, which you'll find in caves, and sometimes even Megalanias if you do have those in the cave. Sometimes you don't always find those, and dung beetles as well, although you don't need to kill those things. They're literally some of the most passive creatures in the game. Mainly it's going to be Onyx are going to be your biggest issue, as they fly around, so they can kind of travel everywhere. But Titanoboas, which I didn't actually mention before, are going to be a huge issue too. But they're also really great for the underwater caves due to a right click spin attack, which can stun creatures up to the size of a Megalodon, which, as far as I'm concerned, no other Ark creature can do. And it kind of gives you a ticket out if you do need to take that. But overall, the best caving creature on the island. If you're thinking of doing caves, tame yourself a Baryonyx and then go into them. Unless it's the artifact of the Skylord, then this thing is just not going to fit. Now, controversial, I know, but in at number 1, I'm putting the Carno. And if you hate the Carno and you want to go for a Allo, then just pretend I'm talking about the Allosaurus here, as that is another great kind of beginner tame, and especially on ASA because they have those baby spawns. So if you're an Allo person, I'm talking about the Allo here. If you're a Carno person like me, I'm so strongly a Carno person, unless it's SOTF actually, as I found out, then I will choose the Allo. But for general Ark, I always choose the Carno. My first reason for that is they're easier to tame, as they don't spawn in packs. Then also, I know with the baby thing, they're kind of the same difficulty, although you'll still get packs of Allos, but then you can get more than one Allo in one go. Either way, Yep, they're smaller and so they don't spawn in packs, and the size actually does play to a benefit. It doesn't make them easier to tame, it makes them kind of easier to trap if you don't need to build such a large trap to put them in, especially if you're taming more than one at the same time. In the case of allos, they're not as fast as the allo, but I prefer the smaller size. For some reason it makes me feel safer, and even if you do tame one of these things and you're not high enough level for the saddle to be unlocked, you can still have it just following around you if you're going up to the mountains to gather some metal, as they do deal a bleed ability as well. That is right click instead of the left click, which won't deal any bleed damage. And unlike the allo, they don't, unlike the allo, they don't have the pack buff, which the Allosaurus does. But I don't think it is really necessary for one of your first big carnivores, and I can't urge it enough. This is one of the best, if not the best, in my opinion. It is the best beginner tame on the island. But, you know, if you really hate this decision, just go for an allo, I guess. In at number 10, we have the Argentavis. But what makes this creature such a powerful one on the island? And it's mainly considering its damage to size ratio, and also the fact that it can fly around the map for insane distances, considering its stamina and also its weight, because it can carry a lot as well. It is very useful, and it can be used for a lot of things in Ark, obviously mainly metal gathering and other things like that, but they do definitely rack up a fight in the air, and you can kill a handful of things, sometimes even Rexes, if you have a good high level RG. And it wouldn't put me past me if you could maybe even do some bosses with RGs if they were actually allowed into boss arenas. They are actually just really great creatures, and with that regen buff that they have once they eat a dead corpse, they are somewhat OP in some aspects of combat, and I really do admire them for all of that. And obviously, again, their resource gathering, obviously they don't gather resources, but they transport resources. I should say their resource transportation is one of the best in the game, and it has to be admired, especially considering the saddle level not being that late on in the game, and the tame being one of the easiest flyer tames in the game, requiring no real steps, unlike the Rhyniognatha. It's just simply you knock it out, maybe you trap it, and then boom, you have yourself an Argentavis, and it is really just that simple. Right, next up we have the Thyla, but again, what makes the Thyla such a great creature for its powerfulness? And it mainly does come down to its bleed ability, which it really does warrant in all of the best ways, especially considering it is an incredibly mobile tame, capable of climbing vertical surfaces and any kind of wall really. Although in ASA sometimes they do definitely struggle quite a lot due to the badly designed terrain, you could say, that is found all across ASA, and it really is not designed as good as it should be. Compared to normal, just original Ark, the terrain always does suit the creatures like the Thyla on the island. Whereas on ASA, you'll see the mountains really just, I don't know what it is about them in ASA, but their shapes are just so weird. And yes, maybe it looks a bit better, but I'm unsure about the mechanics of the whole thing. But either way, that bleed ability, you've probably already seen actually in this B-roll, but you're going to see it again when I kill a Kentro. And the reason why it is just so useful as an ability, because I'll talk about it a lot in this video, and I think you need to understand, if you don't know already, why the bleed ability is so useful. And the main reason behind the bleed ability's usefulness is it does damage based on percent instead of anything else, so it will do a percentage of a creature's health. So no matter the health of the creature, it will always deal that same percentage of damage, which you can probably tell is really OP. And you don't even need to be attacking that creature for the damage to occur after a certain point, as once that bleed has been inflicted, there's like 30 seconds I think, or 10 seconds or 15, one of those, where that bleed will still just be carried out, and across that timer, that is when that percentage of health will be dealt in terms of damage. And then obviously your bite is gonna do a lot of stuff as well to finish it off, but that bleed ability really does just make every kill so much easier, and now you understand it, you'll get why it is just so OP. Right, next up we have the Carno, and the reason why I put this as a more powerful creature is it tends to have more health than the Thyla, and you know, it does also have that bleed ability as well, so I do think it is definitely worthy of this spot. Although the creature after it is kind of, it goes hand in hand with this creature. It's not the Allo, by the way. It is a very similar sized creature. It doesn't have the bleed ability, but it has some other abilities, which is why I put it a bit higher on the list. And the Carno is actually one of my favourite tames, but I'm taking bias out of the equation here, really, because I'm not going to chuck this thing in at number 1 being the most powerful creature on the island, as we're not really going on how easy it is to tame or all of that. We're just going, well, what is the most powerful? And obviously this is not the most powerful creature on the island. You can do a fair handful of bosses with it, yes, and they'll work quite well. Maybe not the dragon, but stay away from the dragon with any kind of carnivores. I don't advise any kind of carnivores for the dragon boss fight. But for the Megapithecus and the Broodmother, even on Alpha, you can probably get by with some Carnos if you have some really high level ones. And considering their level of when their saddle was unlocked, they are a really great tame for the kind of mid stages of any Ark player's game, as you can really get all that progress done, or the early progress of having a carnivore with this creature. Again, they have the bleed ability, so it's a nice introduction to that. If you have a Thyla and a Carno in the mid game stages, you have a great travel mount, and you also have yourself a great dealer of all of that damage. And the Carno is pretty agile as well, so you can use it as a travel mount, but I will admit that the Thyla is significantly better at traveling around the Ark map than the Carno. So if you have these things, both of them, and you know, maybe some cryopods when they're actually added into ASA, you can have yourself a great team of carnivores in the mid game. In at number 7 we have the Megalosaurus, and yeah, it is very similarly sized to the Carno, but in my opinion it is more powerful. And albeit, yes, it only really works in the night, because in the daytime it just wants to sleep. But you can also find these things on the island in any kind of cave, and I'm not sure if they work in caves all the time. They might do, they might not. Either way, probably not the best caving creature for the island. But when nighttime falls, you have yourself an absolute beast of a creature, and you can see it absolutely just shredding that Carno there with no issues whatsoever. And even if Microraptors get you, it still has an ability which can kind of help you out, as it can grab small creatures in its mouth and just twirl like that. And that is actually something which I'm pretty sure no other creature can do. I know the RG can hold creatures in its beak, but it can't deal damage to them really, at least not at the extent to the Megalosaurus. And it's a really agile one as well, and especially if you're playing on Arboration. I know this is about the island and the creatures on the island, but if you're playing on Arboration, then you can have yourself a really great time with these things, as they are active at this level all of the time and they never sleep. But it is kind of concerning that all other Ark creatures don't sleep, but maybe that's why this thing just has so much power. It actually gets any kind of sleep, and you can see it does wonders against something like a Baryonyx, just easily killed. And even this Spino here, just down so quickly. They really do pack a punch when it comes to damage, and they're quite mobile as well. So when night falls, get a Megalosaurus. Obviously they spawn in caves on the island. You're going to have yourself a blast of a time if, you know, you're doing any kind of meat farming in the night, which actually kind of is a good idea if you use gamma commands, because then you can actually see. Now, the Yutyrannus is definitely an extremely useful creature for doing any kind of boss fights, and it really does rack up in all of that area of expertise. But the main reason for that isn't just because these things deal a lot of damage, although they definitely do, but when the courage roar is taken out, you have yourself a creature which can buff so many creatures up to the fullest. But still, by itself, just ranking it by its own damage, it still is a very powerful creature, and you could definitely do bosses with just Yuties. Although I probably wouldn't recommend it, as you can get some Rexes, or the next creature which is on this list, or even Carnos, or Megalosauruses, or Gigas, or Carcharodontosauruses if you're on Extinction. Yeah, the Yuti is not commonly used because of those roars, obviously, which it has the courage roar and the fear roar. The fear roar is not really useful for bosses because there's a size limit and bosses are quite big, so it's not really going to work. And these creatures sadly don't have the bleed ability, but they still can inflict a lot of damage, and they're kind of like a slightly dumbed down Rex, with obviously those roars which the Rex doesn't have. So it has a slightly different role in the boss arena, but if you were to use it as an actual fighting creature in the boss arena, you still have yourself a pretty great time. In at number 5, right in the middle of the road, we have the Allo. And would it really be a list of the most powerful creatures on the islands without the Allosaurus? This creature deals the bleed ability, travels insanely quickly compared to other carnivores, which is actually, I don't get why people just, I don't know what it is actually. These things are just so much faster than most general carnivores, and it really is a benefit to them. Sadly, for some reason, I've just never really enjoyed an Allo as a creature, but you know, I still have to put this creature on the list, as I do admit it is a very powerful one and extremely useful, and actually a pretty good shout for boss creatures, especially considering the pack buff which they have as well, which none of the creatures on this list so far have had. I'm pretty sure, yeah, definitely not actually when looking at the list which I've just gone through. Yes, these have the pack buff, which basically means they can just buff themselves even more when there is 3 or more, and the alpha of the pack will be determined by what creature is the highest level. And if you don't have Yutys or Deodons in the boss fight, or if you're just going out hunting these things, maybe try your best to ride the pack alpha, and as your creatures kill more things, sometimes the alpha will change and you may have to switch mounts. As always, just remember to have saddles on all of your creatures for boss fights. I know it's a little bit off topic, but saddles aren't just the thing which allows you to ride creatures. They also give armor to your tames so they don't take as much damage back from other dinosaurs, and that is extremely useful in bosses. And the higher level saddle you can get, like going up Ramshackle, Journeyman, all of that, all the way up to Ascendant. I know my order was pretty rubbish there. Not fully confident on the order of everything, I can't remember off the top of my head, but as you go up, you'll see the armor increases, and that just means they have even more damage reduction, and that is why saddles are so useful. So always remember to put saddles on your creatures. But yes, the Allo is actually one of the most powerful creatures on the island, and it really does deserve this spot in my opinion. Also, I kind of wanted 11 creatures on this list, but I'm just going to whack 2 in right here. The Rex is obviously what the B-roll is of, but I'm going to put the Spino here as well, as the Spino is incredibly mobile, and although its health isn't quite as good as the Rex, its damage is slightly higher, so they kind of go hand in hand in terms of powerfulness, and the Spino is significantly more mobile. But the Rex is obviously the more popular creature, again, for that better health stat, and also the Rex just being a more favourable dinosaur overall. If people see the Rex, they will just think of power, and when people start Ark, if they've never played Ark before, they'll probably try and get a Rex, as that is a creature which they know really does pack a punch. And really, is it a dinosaur game without a T-Rex? They are like pretty much the most popular dinosaur out there. If you ask people for a dinosaur, they'll probably say Triceratops, T-Rex, maybe Stegosaurus, and some others. But the T-Rex is bound to come up on that list, and that is obviously why it's more popular. I would argue that the Spino is more powerful, but for the case of doing all of the bosses and all of that, the Rex is obviously going to be the more useful creature, but I have used Spinos for those bosses as well, and it works quite well. And considering that the Spinos are good in water, you can even use them for the Moda boss fight. I've done it before, but I'm going to put them hand in hand, like I've said, because they're kind of matched in terms of what they can really do. The Rex has more health, but the Spino has more ability and deals a little bit more damage. In some cases, obviously, not all cases, sometimes the Rex will just deal more damage than the Spino, and also the Spino has the hydration buff, but still, I'm going to put them both in at the number 4 slot. In at number 3, we have the Giga, and it's kind of crazy to think that the Giga does spawn on the island, as you always think of it as spawning on Extinction, but actually it's very rare on that map as well, and you can quite obviously think of it spawning on Ragnarok. But then when I actually think about it, Tiny Tim, 2016, the Giganotosaurus released on the island, absolutely insane. This creature was capable of so much then, and people didn't really care about its rage meter, as it was just seen as a very cool ability, although it does warrant its powerfulness, which is why it's not in the number 2 spot. And there is a different, newer creature which has sort of replaced the Giga in recent times, although not fully, and the Giga is still extremely useful for its job, and it doesn't have that rage meter, but partly because that isn't really needed in new Ark, considering that now, like every single day at this point, there's just a new creature announced that's just bigger, better, more powerful, insane abilities. And that's really what I felt like with Gen 2 actually. Just all of those creatures are insanely powerful and insanely OP. Yes, you could say you're not really going to take the Maywing into a boss fight, but still, it's an insanely incredible travel mount, which you really don't get out of some maps at all, really. Valguera is an example there. We didn't really get any great travel mounts out of it. Yes, the Deinonychus exists, but it's not the best travel mount out there. We had better options still at that time. In at number 2, we have the Carcharodontosaurus, and this is essentially just now the Giga replacement, one of the newest creatures to Ark, obviously the Rhyniognatha being newer and also spawning on the island, so this being the second newest Ark tame. It is essentially the Giga, but just on some sort of steroids without the rage meter and some improved mobility, of course. As yes, these things do look pretty weird when they walk, but they actually do move with a very decent pace, and also with their taming method being somewhat more interesting. I know it doesn't make them more powerful. I kind of enjoy this tame a little bit more, unless it just gets into a blood rage, and then it's not great at that point. I'm not going to go into details on the taming method, but I do have a guide you can search up on my channel for the Carcharodontosaurus taming guide if you want to know how to tame it. It's not actually that difficult. I'd recommend Raasclark for a map to tame it on if you've never tamed one before, because they're very common in the Highlands biome, because their spawns are the exact same as the Giga. And also in terms of that blood rage ability, that is the reason why they're also more powerful than the Rex, the Giga. What am I talking about? They're way more powerful than the Rex. But either way, the reason for that is because the blood rage scales their damage up, so when that's full, they deal even more damage than the Giga, and without the rage meter, they essentially have more usable health than the Giga. Yes, the Giga has, in some cases, more health, but they can't utilize all of that because of that rage meter, whereas the Carcharodontosaurus can utilize all of it right down to 1 HP. And in at number 1 is the Rhyniognatha, the newest creature to Ark, and as Squid put it in his latest Ark creature, what am I talking about? The latest Ark episode. It is the creature which shoots lasers. It's the laser shooting creature. Absolutely insane. Like, this creature is on another level. Obviously spawning on the island and Lost Island and then the swamp biome, which is why now the swamps are even worse than they usually are. I'm like, why do this wildcard to the swamps? Like, I know they're a really nice creature, they're a great creature, and they are actually kind of rare on normal Ark, which I like, but on ASA they are absolutely everywhere, and it makes these swamp biomes the worst map to go to on the island by far. The redwoods, it can't even compare. Imagine if the redwoods had like little Rhyniognatha, baby Rhyniognatha's that just jump from the trees and shot lasers at you. That would be please don't add that wildcard. I really pray that you don't. But yeah, the Rhyniognatha just full of so many abilities. This thing can literally pick up Rexes. Its abilities are insane, so it is definitely deserving of the number 1 spot. In at number 10, we have the Carno. And the reason why I would say this is a dangerous creature is it is one of the faster carnivores about on the island, and I know there are some other creatures which you may think, like the Thyla, but I'm not putting the Thyla on this list as they aren't as common around the map. But, you know, if you really do think Thylas are the most dangerous thing in the world, I don't know why, I've never really had a struggle with Thylas, then just pretend I'm talking about Thylas and not Carnos here. But with the Carno, they deal the bleed damage, again like the Thyla, so maybe I'll feel obliged to put the Thyla in this spot as well, because the Thyla isn't on the list. Yeah, Thyla and Carno in at number 10, because they deal the bleed ability, they're pretty mobile, and especially with the Carno, they do spawn like absolutely everywhere, and they are pretty easy to trap on normal Ark and ASA. Obviously they're a little bit harder because of the Dino AI, so they avoid traps now, which is a new and innovative feature. And actually, when I tamed a Carno on ASA, it was a lot more of a pain to get it in, and with Argies as well, they're a lot more of a pain. Like, just so much more of a pain, because they don't want to go in the trap. It makes sense, to be honest. A creature wouldn't really do that in real life, but you can still get them in if you just keep going around in circles. Eventually it will happen. You kind of just need to get round quick enough that it doesn't have time to think through it. But yeah, Carno and Thyla in at number 10. In at number 9, we have the Yuty. But why would I put the Yuty in at this spot? Well, the main reason for it is that roaring ability really is lethal if you end up in the wrong place at the wrong time and it roars, and you really can end up in a huge predicament with this thing. And they deal quite a hefty amount of damage as well. Like, I know a lot of people don't really think of the UT for dealing loads of damage, as you don't really use it for that, you use it for its roars. It deals a very hefty amount of damage, and it has some pretty fast mobility as well. if you ever try to tame a Yuty, which is probably most of us to be honest, you'll know how fast these things are, but for people who haven't, the Yutys are pretty fast, and you should definitely be careful of these creatures around, as you really do not want to get into a fight with a Yuty, unless obviously you're very well prepared. Then I think you'll be fine, but you know, still, Yuty definitely a dangerous creature, and that's why I put it in at the number 9 spot. Next up, we've got the Rex, and this is just one of those creatures where you kind of have to put it on the list. Although they are quite slow creatures and kind of easy to avoid, the Rex stand kill can still be a big challenge for many Ark players out there, as you struggle to get away from it sometimes, especially in ASA. Now you can't level up movement speed unless you obviously enable the setting. It's kind of like flyer speed leveling, like Wildcard removed it, but they never really got rid of it because you could always enable that setting in single player. But still, it is now harder to run away from Rexes than it ever has been before, although they are so much easier to tame because of those Rex babies. Honestly, that is an absolute hack for taming Rexes on ASA. Definitely advise it if you've never done that already, and obviously you have ASA, as I know a lot of my viewers don't actually have ASA at the moment because it's too darn expensive, and it's also quite a pain to run, although most of my viewers do seem to be console ones, and me being a PC player, I'm upgrading my computer actually to play this game even better, but I've had on consoles that actually runs pretty well. But to talk about the Rex, you can say it's a dangerous creature. It definitely falls into that bracket, and they're quite common as well. Just maybe not the fastest, so if you have tons of movement speed, you should be fine. Right, in at number 7, we have got the Spino. And why do I think the Spino is the 7th most dangerous creature on the island? Well, the reason mainly for it is its speed. It is one of the fastest carnivores out there, and it is pretty lethal in the water as well, which most other carnivores really can't hold up, as things like the Rex, they really can't swim well at all. And you know, you try and go into the water, that Rex is never going to catch up with you, even a player on really slow movement speed, unless obviously the water's shallow enough and it can just walk itself along over the top of it. But with the Spino, you can't really get that, and they tend to spawn in more hostile areas as well. Although they don't really spawn around other more hostile creatures, they tend to spawn in places like the snow biome on the island, which is a lot more of a hostile environment than just the general South Zone one, which players will experience as they spawn in. And yet again, that water ability of them just being able to be really good swimmers is something which makes them a lot more deadly, and also they have the bleed ability, so they deal even more damage there. They really do pack a punch when it comes to damage, although if you've got enough, like, you've got good enough armor, you can probably just face them off in melee, as their health isn't the greatest, although still a very dangerous creature, and it will take a pretty powerful weapon to do that without killing yourself, and also doing that before your armor breaks. Now, next up we have the Theri, and the first thing I have to say, this thing's saddle is unlocked at level 69. And yes, what a nice thing for it to have. But that's not why it is dangerous. The 69 curse, although present in the Theri saddle, doesn't mean you have to obviously tame this thing at that level. And actually, they are pretty difficult for taming because they're kind of dangerous, and also because they take a while, especially on official settings. Although very well worth it, especially for defeating the dragon on the island. But why are these things so deadly? Well, they don't really appear to be so hostile, and if you go close to them, they will just chase you for ages and ages and ages, and you really can't get them off of your back. And you know, that is a pretty irritating thing with a creature. Yeah, they can be dangerous, but if they de-aggro quickly, then you're not really going to have an issue. Whereas these things just never, ever seem to give up, and they just keep battling and battling and battling over and over again, just across the whole island map. I know there is a little bit of hyperbole there, but still, these things have an incredible long aggro distance, and that kind of really makes them extremely dangerous, and their damage is also ridiculously high. But it kind of makes sense. They do have massive claws. That would hurt. In at number 5, we have the Allosaurus, and this creature had to be here. It is so fast, and it deals the bleed ability, and they usually come in packs, and they spawn in hostile regions of the map. So they're pretty hard to deal with, especially because they come in packs. That can be a very tough thing to get around, because maybe you'll be able to take off one really easily like that, but trying to take on 3, that is a completely different story, and it's going to require significantly more effort for you to put in to actually be able to defeat all of those creatures. That's why they're a lot more dangerous, especially if you're a solo player, which actually I'm not sure what the statistics are like. I'm not sure if most Ark players are multiplayer or solo players, as in like, not as in they play on servers and they play on single player, but as in like they play with friends or they just play by themselves on multiplayer servers. Not actually sure, but I think it's more single player heavy, so you're more likely to be playing Ark solo, at least from my experience. For you, you might have never played Ark solo and you always play with friends, and I might be sounding like a complete idiot right now, but from my experience, Ark is usually a solo game for me, and on single player, especially earlier, even to the mid game, even sometimes in the late mid game, these things are just a no-go. You just don't go near these things. But then in the late game, they're not the worst thing ever. You can deal with a pack of them, but maybe 2 packs would be a little bit too far, unless you've just got the full tech charade, and then you'd be alright with no issues at all, and there's not really a point about talking about these creatures. But at that point, you can pretty much kill every Ark creature with absolute ease. That, you know, frankly, is any creature dangerous at that point? The only thing that would really be dangerous is things like turrets. They do a lot of damage. Next up, we've got the Microraptor, and I had to put this thing on the list here, as this thing, if you're flying in the air and it knocks you off your flying mount, or any mount if you're in any kind of combat, you can have yourself some serious issues, as you may not be able to defend yourself, and also you'll be stunned at the same time. You can kind of say the Polovia is in a similar spot to this creature, so kind of do the same thing, although these things can fly, which is why I put them here instead. It is a really lethal and frankly quite unfair ability for a creature to have, and that is why for a creature this small, it is insane that it is this deadly. Seriously, beware of Microraptors. In at number 3, we have the Giga, and the Tiny Tim is obviously an absolute beast of the Ark space, and you really can't get over this being like a really powerful and deadly, dangerous creature. Well, it is the most dangerous creatures on the island after all, and there really pretty much isn't anything more dangerous than this thing. Obviously, once tamed, it does have the rage meter, and a wild one is significantly more dangerous than a tamed one, but we are talking about wild ones, so it kind of makes sense. These things are absolutely insane in the wild, and still insane once tamed. Just they lose their bleed ability, then they get the rage meter, so they don't really have the health which they say. It's like a little bit of a lie, because you only get a certain percentage of it, but you know, still really, really OP. And when they were introduced into the game, they were like one of the like beast creatures on the map, and you know, you couldn't really discount them for that. But yeah, the Giga's in at number 3. Let's continue on with the list. In at number 2, we have the Carcharodontosaurus, and this is just essentially the Giga on steroids, which is why I have put it on this spot in the list, of course. And you know, I do think it is very deserving of this spot in the list, as it is an extremely powerful creature, dealing a wealth of damage with just, frankly, that blood rage is something which is absolutely insane. Also, I don't really recommend taming the Carcharodontosaurus on the island. Do it on Raasclark, as they're so much more common, as you're really not going to find these things that often on Ark. And compared to the creature on number 1, these are some of the most rare creatures out there, unless you're just playing normal Ark. If you're playing ASA, then they won't be like as rare as the creature in number 1, maybe kind of equal to, really. But on ASA, the creature in at number 1 is just, it spawns absolutely everywhere. I kind of feel like there's a bit of an overspawn. But before we do get into the creature which is in at number 1, just a couple quick honorable mentions. I know I've kind of put the Thyla in at number 10, although it wasn't really on the list. I'll mention it again. And the Megalosaurus, and obviously the Titanosaur, because that creature I didn't put on the list, and I don't think it's too dangerous, because if you go up and you just attack a Titanosaur, isn't that a little bit stupid? And the creature in at number 1 will just attack you no matter what. So let's get into that creature. And in at number 1 is the Rhyniognatha. And did you really expect anything else? Especially on ASA, because these things spawn absolutely everywhere. It's actually kind of insane, and I'm a little bit disturbed in a way at how much they spawn. They only spawn on the island and Lost Island actually in these locations, or if you want just a broad term, the swamp biome on the island and the Lost Island. And on the older version of Ark, you'll need to use mods like Creature Finder Deluxe if you want to guarantee a quick find. And as you can see, I didn't even have any on my map, so I had to raise my dino count and then obviously use the command destroy wild dinos, and then boom, you have done a dino wipe on your world. And you know, that just means it's just going to kill the wild dinos on your map. And I think you're supposed to put destroy all wild dinos instead of destroy wild dinos, but it might also be that one. Try both. Just there's one which is quite similar, which will also kill your own tame creatures, and you really don't want to do that. But the Rhyniognatha, like, basically shoots lasers and deals an insane amount of damage. This thing can also pick up Rexes. That's insane. But at least its tame method is insane, and I'll just quickly run through it. You steal a pheromone from a... Is it pheromone? You steal that from killing a male Rhyniognatha. Get those resources. If you want 100% effectiveness, again, it's not really a boss creature, so I wouldn't say it is very necessary. Then trap it in some way. The net gun is my preferred method, which is obviously why I'd use the net gun in this example here. Then, similarly to the Reaper, just get its health as low as possible. Sadly, there isn't really an indicator. I'm pretty sure, like, it won't glow a certain color once you've got it. It may glow orange, but in all of this and through taming it, it didn't glow any color. So just rely on something like the magnifying glass, or if you have access to mods, use the awesome spyglass. Again, if you're on ASA, no matter what platform, you can use the awesome spyglass, as you can just look up the mod section. Then feed that pheromone, definitely is a pheromone because it just said there, to your Bronto. Yeah, you're going to need a Bronto as well. Don't necessarily need one, but you need a creature for it that will work. The Bronto is just the easiest, best one really for effectiveness, obviously. And then it will have its craving timers, it will die, so don't choose an important Bronto if that even exists. And then you'll get yourself a Rhyniognatha baby. In at number 10, we have the Spino. And this is a creature which I think is an extremely underrated one. And it often gets forgotten about in most lists of some great Ark carnivores. And I know this isn't a great Ark carnivores list. This is the best late game island tames. Doesn't also mean that they have to be tamed in the late game. I am slightly twisting the definitions around a bit. But there's only really one creature which kind of falls into that slot, because it's technically really a mid-game creature. But there are so many creatures you can include on this list. But the Spino, in my opinion, had to be one of them. It is extremely mobile. Obviously spawns on the island. That is a requirement for it to be on the best late game, the island tames. They do have to spawn on the map. And the fact with its mobility that allows it to spin 360 degrees on the spot, like, the Rex couldn't do that. Like, nothing could make the Rex do that. And also, they're really great in the water as well, and they have the hydration buff. And someone said recently that I accidentally said the Spinos had the bleed ability. If I ever said that, I am sorry, I didn't mean it. They do not have the bleed ability, but Rexes don't have the bleed ability either, so, you know. And actually, overall, these things do a little bit more damage than Rexes. And back in the day, like 2016, 2015 Ark, they were seen as more powerful than Rexes. Like, this one was just a bigger, more powerful carnivore, whereas the Rexes kind of taken all of the scene nowadays, and these things are pretty much forgotten about. And they can even go on their hind legs too. That was part of the TLC update that they had at some point, allowing them to deal even more damage. And they're really great carnivores, so I simply had to include them on this list. And I really hope that you agree with me on this one. Next up, we've got the Giga, and since this is an extinction, I can't put these things so high on the list, as for the islands you simply don't need this kind of creature, but I have to put it on here. Come on, the best late games of the island in terms of tames, the Giga, the Tiny Tim, has to be on here. It's an absolute beast, packing loads of damage, but the reason why I say you don't need it is it isn't allowed into boss fights on the island. The Rex is pretty much as powerful as you can get, really, for boss creatures on the island. And I know that's a really, really huge generalization, but, you know, we'll just go along with it. Either way, the Giga can't be allowed into boss fights, so it has no boss use. If this was extinction, however, I'll put these things so high on the list. Like, man, they are so useful on that map. But they are still useful for gathering resources on the island, like hide and meat and all of that, and they're just really fun to ride on, to be honest. That's another great benefit. They are huge. The only real downside being their terrible stamina and their rage meter, so it kind of gives them a percentage of their own health, so they don't technically have their true amount of health. Still, I had to include it on the list. Come on, it is the Giga. Next up, following the huge carnivore trend, we have the Carcharodontosaurus, and this is kind of here for a similar reason. It's a big carnivore that deals a hell of a lot of damage, and it spawns where the Giga would spawn, and it's essentially just the Giga, but a little bit better in my eyes, so that's why it's slightly better on the list. It comes in at the number 8 spot instead of the number 9 spot, but the overall premise of the creature is pretty much the same. Again, big carnivore, deals loads of damage, it does all the same stuff. Yes, it has a blood rage, which allows it to do more damage than the Giga when full, and it doesn't have a rage meter, so it has its full health rather than the percentage of its health. And on top of that, its stamina isn't the most atrocious thing you've ever seen. They are pretty much the same thing, and I'm demonstrating its stamina leveling here, which isn't awful, but don't do that. Don't put all your levels into stamina on this thing. That is not what you want to be doing with this creature. Honestly, don't go near the stamina stat. Just leave it as it is. It is alright. It is fine. It is so much better than the Gigas, but if you really need it, get a stamina mutation. And although I would advise you tame one of these things on Ragnarok, they can still be tamed on the island. I do have a taming guide video if you want to check that out. If I remember, there'll be a card at the top of the video. If not, there'll be nothing. Right, in at number 7, we have got the Rhyniognatha, and I had to put this thing here. Come on, this thing can literally pick up Rexes. It does have to be warranted as one of the best late game the island creatures. And what a late game creature this is. Honestly, it's absurd, like its taming method and all of that. It only spawns on the island under Lost Island, actually. And in normal, I'm still going to call it normal Ark, really, because ASA hasn't normalized itself in the Ark community. It's pretty much half and half, I think, at the moment, if the numbers are to be right, because ASA, frankly, is too expensive, and on most things, it doesn't run very well. On the consoles, though, if you do get ASA on a console, you'll be fine with it. It will be a perfect experience for that console, and it will work. But on PC, I'm literally buying a 3090, which at the time of me recording this video is a £650 used card, let alone its price new, just to play a dinosaur game. But thanks to you guys, all of you watching these videos out there, I've actually been able to afford a card like that for my own personal rig. Currently, I still have the 2060 Super in it, but soon, in about should be maybe 2 weeks from now, I'll have a 3090 in this thing, and then going on later in the year, I'm going to go for a 3950X and get some more RAM, because 16 gigs isn't really enough anymore, especially for ASA. It does actually recommend 32 gigs of the stuff. Also, if you noticed here, I've been with the B-roll, I should have said, sorry, cancel my last point there. I've got technology stuff in my mind. Either way, the B-roll there has been showing you how to tame one, which is from my video of how to tame one. Again, if I remember, I will leave a card. If not, there won't be a card there, and you just have to look up Rhyniognatha. But the taming method for the Rhyniognatha is pretty much an exact copy of the Reaper taming method, so if you know that, then you'll be fine. But there's just a couple of extra steps, but it's not too complicated, but definitely is a late game tame, because you're going to need a lot of resources for it, especially if you want 100% effectiveness. Next up, we've got the Yutyrannus, and this creature is one of those tames where I don't feel right if I have not tamed this thing on the island, and it's so essential for any kind of boss fights. I had to put it on this list. It has to be here, okay? This is the Yutyrannus. It gives that buff to all of your creatures with the courage roar in the boss fight, and paired with a Deon, it really does work. Although I found the Deon isn't the most essential nowadays, and actually I have done quite a few things without the Deon. I've just paid more attention and put my health into my Rexes or whatever boss creature I'm using. I admit a Deon is helpful, so that is why I'm giving it a small mention here, although it is not making this list of the best late game arc tames. And actually, towards the late game, it does become a lot more boss orientated, and you'll see that with the next 4 or so creatures. But actually, the creature in at number 1 is not boss orientated at all, and I wonder if you can guess it. If you do guess it before the number 1 slot, then put a time pin down from when you actually guessed what that creature is. Right, now at number 5 is the Baryonyx. Almost couldn't say 5 there. And luckily, now we have got all my personal life out of the way and all my tech life out of the way. We can now focus more on the dinosaurs, as I'm sure you don't need a full lecture right now on my life story. Either way, the Baryonyx is a pretty easy tame for it to be making this list, and it is the second easiest, I would say, on the list. The creature in at number 1, I'm going to give you another clue there, is... No, it is the easiest tame. The second easiest tame is at number 1. It's a very simple knockout tame, spawns in the swamp biome. I think you can find it in some other places as well. Definitely can, not just in the swamp biome. But if you really want to guarantee finding one, just head there. Make sure to avoid swamp fever. Either way, they're the best caving creature on the island, which is why I put them in this list. And they have a right click spin attack which can stun creatures up to the size of a Megalodon, which makes them pretty useful for underwater caves as well. And I know you can use Sarcos and Basilos and all of that, but for me the Barry does everything, and that is why I use it. Apart from the artifacts of the Skylord, that cave is far too tiny for pretty much any creature to fit in, unless you have a dung beetle for caving for some reason. Next up, we've got the Megatherium, and this is here for the chitin gathering, but mainly because of its insanity against the Broodmother boss fight on the island, and obviously that is why it has made the list, and that is why it is here. It is the best creature on the island for defeating the Broodmother, as it sort of gets a rage buff, you could kind of call it. Not in the case of what the Giga has, or... It's very similar to the Carcharodontosaurus's Blood Rage, although doesn't really involve blood, and a sort of alpha buff glow to it, and essentially, once it's killed an insect, it will deal absurd damage to just everything, and I think there's a 500-second time or something like that, but considering the Broodmother constantly spawns spider minions at you, pretty stupid of it, I know. They will constantly replenish that buff, so that buff will always be active, and in the presence of a Yuty buffing them even further, you can have yourself a pretty insane army against insects, as I think it gives them damage, and then obviously some damage reduction on top of that as well. And again, you're going to get a lot of chitin from that Broodmother boss fight, so I guess if you want loads of chitin instead of going to the insect cave, just do the Gamma Broodmother a lot, or you can do the Alpha Broodmother or the Beta one. It doesn't really matter. Any Broodmother stage will work perfectly with this thing. No issues at all. They are the go-to for the Broodmother, which is obviously why I've had to put them on this list. And in a second, you'll see what that buff looks like. And, you know, maybe you can see what I mean by it looks alpha buff-like. In at number 3, we have the Theri. And this creature had to be in here. Firstly, because its saddle is unlocked at level 69.
Nice.
I know, that is a very nice one. Obviously, makes this thing the perfect arc creature. There is nothing better than it. But the reason for this creature being on the list is, firstly, its gathering abilities. This thing is insane at gathering all things fiber, wood, thatch, meat, hide, and it can't gather rocks, so I won't bother talking about those. And in my opinion, it's kind of more useful than you say an Anki and a Dodic, but I will give them a small mention here for gathering. They're not on this list, by the way, but the creature in at number 1 is extremely useful with a creature like the Anki and the Dodic. Have you got it yet? Have you not? Either way, the other use for this creature is that it is the best creature on the island for the dragon boss fight. The only downside being it's a herbivore, so for it to heal quickly, you will need sweet vegetable cake. This is where I would say a Deon is very necessary to make sure these things stay alive during the boss fight, as then they can actually heal up quite quickly and effectively, because they don't have the ease of meat. A sweet vegetable cake is particularly expensive, and you probably can't get thousands and thousands of it, just like you would get thousands and thousands of meat. But the reason why they're so good at the dragon boss fight is the dragon has a particular buff or debuff for carnivores with its inflamed fire buff, whereas this thing's a herbivore, so it doesn't get that. In at number 2, we have the Rex, and I had to include this thing on the list. I'm not going to put it in at the number 1. By now you probably should be able to tell what is in the number 1 spot. Again, comment down that time code once you figured out what the number 1 creature is. But either way, this creature, the Rex obviously, is the go-to creature for any kind of boss fight. Yes, it does have a slight debuff in the dragon boss fight, and it doesn't have the buff the Megatherium has in the Broodmother boss fight. It still works for all of them, although I would mainly use it for the Megapithecus because that's the only other one. But actually, nowadays, I kind of tend to use Spinos more for that boss fight because they tend to not fall into the absolute death hole that's there in the arena, which is pretty annoying, but you know, you can get around it easily with Rexes. It just, they tend to get stuck a little bit more, which is why I don't really like them for that. But there is no denying they are a really great boss creature, and with how easy they are to tame on ASA, it just has to be in at the number 2 spot. And it doesn't. I can't even speak anymore. Either way, it doesn't deserve any less, in my opinion, or any more. But before we get into the number 1 spots, just a quick honorable mentions. The Allo is a pretty good boss creature. The Megalosaurus does definitely pack a punch as well. Creatures like the Sarco are pretty great water tames, although maybe not in the late game. You could still say they do definitely pack a punch. The Basilo is a great option for underwater caving in the late stages of the game, and a creature like a Thyla is always very nice to hand. But let's get into the tame in at number 1. In at number 1, we have the Argentavis. Have you guessed it now, by the way? 1433. It should be the latest that you've guessed what this creature is. Either way, this, in my opinion, is the best Arc late game tame for the island. It is just such a useful flyer for traveling from A to B. With Cryopods, you can travel with any creatures which you want, and it is always my go-to flyer. And if flyer speed leveling was still a thing, then maybe I would go for a Quetz, but they are so slow, and also I still prefer the Argy in a lot of ways. Although it can't pick up as much as a Quetzal, it is faster than the Quetzal, and it has weight reduction on many resources like metal, crystal, and obsidian, making it a go-to for all of that metal farming. And metal is an essential resource in Arc Ready. To actually complete it, you'll want at least some flat gear, and you'll probably want a pump action shotgun, and obviously metal tools so you can make your gathering process as efficient as possible. And when paired with an Anki and a Dodic, you have yourself an even better creature. And they are so easy to tame. That's how they're being unlocked at level 68. Yes, just one off the perfect level. At least I'm pretty sure it's 68. It's either 68 or 62. It is somewhere in the 60 type of range, but before level 69, obviously. But yes, in my opinion, the RG is the best. Its saddle also acts as a portable smithy, and it has a really nice regen buff too. You really can't live on the island without an RG in my opinion. But anyway, that is the end of today's video, and I want to know down in the comments below also when you figured out that the RG was in at number 1 and your favourite late game tame for the island, and did you agree with this list also? And I will see you all later.